the 1920s. Most of you probably think of this decade as the Roaring Twenties, a time of flappers and jazz music and Great Gatsby type parties happening all the time, but the reality was different. I mean, the 1920s was a time of great cultural change, but it was also a time when intellectuals began to question the 19th century's over-reliance on science, a reliance which had cavalierly led generals to conclude that the war which broke out in the late summer of 1914 would have soldiers home before the leaves fell. What follows is the story of the Age of Anxiety. As you now know, the Great War was overwhelming in its intensity, and its aftermath left a lingering confusion and uncertainty. War veterans, especially those who'd suffered a long-lasting physical injury, were often incredibly bitter at having been forced to continue fighting a war that no one had seemed to know how to direct. Civilians struggled at first to get back to normal as well. The uncertainty of life had a profound effect on the emotional health of all those who had survived the war. Today, we'd call their mental health disorder PTSD, but at the time, governments referred to battle fatigue and tended to brush away these struggles. In fact, the aftermath of the Great War had some similarity to the mindset of Europe just after the Black Death. Live for today because you're not sure if you'll be here tomorrow. While various countries tried to return to normal after the war, the population fell into what historians call the Age of Anxiety, which was characterized by uncertainty due to the aftermath of war and the seeming chaos of quick cultural change. Now, to make matters worse, countries in Europe, and particularly those countries new or old, which had been a part of the Central Powers, they suffered from inflation after the war. The children in this photograph at right are using German currency as toys. That is how worthless the German mark was. It was indeed a time of great uncertainty. Of course, there were happenings unrelated to the Great War which also occurred in the 19-teens and which influenced the interwar period, such as the revolution in Mexico. As is often the case, we have to take a step back in order to understand what was happening, so this story will begin in the late 19th century. At that time, Mexico's government had allowed for extensive American investment in Mexico, often at the expense of Mexican businesses and entrepreneurship. By the turn of the 20th century, many Mexicans were fed up with the situation and they sought to correct it. The first people to attempt correction were, as we might expect, the wealthy Mexicans who felt they were being pushed out of lucrative opportunities. These Mexicans challenged the sitting president, who was really a dictator, Porfirio Diaz, in 1910. Diaz fled into exile, allowing the Creole Francisco Madero to become president. While the wealthy Creoles welcomed this change, many mestizos, especially those who worked in the countryside, the peasants, they remained critical of the government and especially of the motivation of those wealthy Creoles. The most well-known of these peasant critics were Emiliano Zapata and Francisco Pancho Villa. They were part agrarian rebels and part social rebels, and they enjoyed an enormous amount of popular support. Zapata, who operated from the southern state of Morelos, organized mestizo and indigenous communities against the Mexican government. His followers, the Zapatistas, hoped to rebuild traditional village communities from lands taken by the government or foreign interests. Villa operated from the northern state of Chihuahua, from which he led his army of about 3,000 men and women. His goal was to take over lands owned by the wealthy and to redistribute them among the poor, establishing family ranches. For this reason, Villa was often referred to as the Mexican Robin Hood. Despite popular support for Zapata and Villa, these men were considered a hindrance by the various parties, made up mostly of wealthy Mexicans, fighting for the leadership of Mexico's government. Zapata was a liability because he wanted lands returned to native peoples, and those native peoples were willing to fight the government to achieve that goal. He was killed in 1919 during a skirmish with the Mexican army, and then the government didn't have to worry about him anymore. Villa was a liability in part because he was causing problems with the United States. His army at least once raided across the U.S.-Mexico border. In 1923, Villa was assassinated, probably on orders from the Mexican president. The new Mexican government, led by the Constitutionalist Party, actually adopted reforms similar to those for which Zapata and Villa were fighting. The new constitution, adopted in 1917, promised universal suffrage, a one-term presidency, state-run education, the end of debt peonage, which was like indentured servitude, the restriction of foreign ownership of property so that most Mexican land was in fact owned by Mexicans, and laws specifying minimum wages and maximum work hours. As Mexico headed into the 1920s, it had firmly aligned itself with the democratic governments of the world. Now, China was experiencing turmoil similar to that of Mexico. You'll remember that after the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, China was forced to adopt the open door policy with Europe. As a result, China's monarchy was even more fragile than it had ever been. The empress died in 1908, and her heir was a toddler. There were revolts in the fall and winter of 1911, which led to the abdication of the last Qing emperor, who was 7, and the foundation of the Republic of China in February of 1912. The leader of this new country was a modern-minded revolutionary named Sun Yat-sen. Sun was eager to have China adopt democratic values and to join the globalizing industrial economy, as called for by the platform of his political party, the Kuomintang, or the Nationalist Party. Sun's government was based on what he called the 3 principles of the people: nationalism, an end to foreign control; people's rights, or democracy; and people's livelihood, or economic security, by way of industrialization. However, it soon became clear that Sun was an ideas man. He wasn't great at maintaining authority, as he lacked military support that had always been so important for China's leaders to have. Sun resigned as president, having hand-picked a successor who had military ties. It was a grand gesture, but one that led to more turmoil. Sun's successor betrayed the 3 principles and became a dictator who sparked widespread revolts and then, ironically, lost control of the military. Sun tried to retake the government, but he couldn't quite control the entire nation now that it had fractured with revolt. Warlords controlled parts of the countryside, and subsequent Republican leaders would struggle to govern. Now, beyond these non-Great War-related political changes, there were also non-Great War-related scientific and technological changes. At the very end of the 19th century, a 50-year-old German physicist, Wilhelm Röntgen, discovered the existence of X-rays, a discovery which earned him the very first Nobel Prize in Physics in 1901. In a French lab a few years later, Marie and Pierre Curie would make their startling discovery of radioactivity. Marie continued to work after Pierre's death. She went on to develop methods for measuring radioactivity, that's the half-life, which I know you're very comfortable with thanks to your chemistry course. Marie Curie helped to develop mobile X-ray units that helped treat Allied soldiers during the Great War. But the discovery of radioactivity and its medical application wasn't all that was changing in the scientific field. In 1911, British physicist Ernest Rutherford argued that even solid matter was made up of lots of space because of atomic structure, which he hypothesized to be a well-defined nucleus with a specific charge surrounded by space and the atom's subparticles. He's credited with founding the field of quantum physics, or the study of matter and radiation on the atomic level. German-born physicist Albert Einstein was looking at the world in a much larger context than Rutherford was, and, at least with regards to the introduction of new ideas, he'd have a much larger impact on society. He developed his general theory of relativity between 1905 and 1915, in which he challenged classical Newtonian reliance on space and time as unchanging frames of reference for the universe. He argued that Newton's laws of motion start to break down once objects achieve speeds close to that of light. Basically, Einstein's ideas opened up all sorts of crazy possibilities, including time travel, that seemed to throw the field of science into further chaos, yet another reason why this interwar period was so unsettling. As exciting as some of the scientific ideas were, many people were more gratified by one sweeping change. Beyond the creation of the successor states, one of the biggest political changes to emerge in the aftermath of the Great War was women's suffrage, women's right to vote. Some of the British Commonwealth states, such as Australia, had given women the right to vote at the turn of the 20th century. Most women, however, would have to wait to vote in national elections until after the Great War. Often, governments rationalized granting women the right to vote as a reward for women's hard work and sacrifice during the Great War, at times completely ignoring the fact that women had been seriously advocating for suffrage since the Enlightenment. In Russia, after the October or Bolshevik Revolution in 1917, women were granted the right to vote, and this was extended throughout all of the Soviet Socialist Republics, the SSRs, after the creation of the USSR. In the United States, the 19th Amendment, which grants women the right to vote, was ratified in June of 1920. Of course, gaining the right to vote wasn't a promise of equality in all things. Often, once the men returned from their service in war, they were welcomed back to their old jobs, and the women who'd filled in during the war now often found themselves unemployed, expected to keep house for their husbands again, or, if they were unmarried, expected to find a man to marry and to raise a family. However, some women had grown accustomed to working during the Great War, and they were able to continue their employment, which began to influence gender equality in the workforce. In fact, women were at the forefront of social cultural changes in the 1920s, as young women in particular began to challenge the patriarchal status quo. Fashion changed in part to reflect these social changes. Rather than the exaggerated hourglass figures and doll-like hairstyles which predominated during the turn of the century, it was the flapper, with her simple, body-skimming style, her bobbed haircut, and her makeup, which became the new feminine fashion. Women also began drinking and smoking in public, which flew directly in the face of tradition. Her music reflected these social changes too. A popular new genre was jazz, a musical style developed in the United States in areas around New Orleans and Memphis and Chicago by mostly African American musicians. This new style of music was lively, with a loose beat and syncopated or offbeat rhythms that exemplified the ideals of the 1920s, to abandon tradition and be different. Jazz music was often modified for wealthier white audiences. White musicians, often using a wider variety of instruments than traditional jazz entailed, toured as jazz ensembles to play for white audiences. Dancing also changed. Whereas the early 19th century had been scandalized at the introduction of the waltz, which required couples to touch when they danced, the early 20th century was mortified by the Charleston and related dances. Just think about it. The waltz is elegant, and despite the fact that a man's hand rested on a woman's waist while dancing, the waltz still required a certain distance between the two dancers to allow for the movement of skirts and feet. The Charleston, on the other hand, wasn't necessarily a traditional paired dance, and it required contortions and gyrations that had all sorts of body parts moving. These body parts now revealed by new fashion. They were moving around in positively indecent ways, at least according to the older generation. The joy and cultural experimentation of the 1920s, which was accompanied by a booming economy in some Allied countries, came to a crashing halt in late October of 1929. In the United States, the stock market crashed, which led to a run on the banks, during which Americans tried to liquidate their wealth on the market and in their bank accounts, preferring to keep their cash on hand with them. This move made currency incredibly scarce, and it inhibited banks from doing business. Banks closed, and as they did, businesses which depended on bank loans to keep operating closed as well, laying off their workers. So, unemployment soared. And, given the fact that the economy was now global, the stock market crash in the United States affected economies around the world. A worst hit were those countries who'd already been struggling in the aftermath of war. Countries like the Weimar Republic and the various successor states in Europe. Countries like Italy and the Soviet Union, who were politically weakened due to instability or, in the case of the Soviet Union, the after effects of a civil war. From the European perspective, then, this would be the worst time to experience instability in their colonies, and yet that's, of course, exactly what happened. In the aftermath of World War I, when so many colonial peoples had fought for their colonizer, it was inevitable that they'd hope for some recognition, usually in the form of autonomy or independence, in return. However, after 1919, most European countries just wanted everything to go back to the status quo, and that was not something that made colonial people happy. In British South Asia, Mohandas Gandhi emerged as a leader of the nationalist movement. Gandhi's non-violent civil disobedience earned him the nickname Mahatma, meaning great soul. Using his growing influence, Gandhi called for the boycott of British goods and services so as to hit Britain where it would hurt most, particularly after a difficult war and the Great Depression: the economy. Perhaps his most famous boycott was the Salt March of 1930, in which Gandhi and his followers protested the Salt Acts, which required Indians to buy salt from the British and to pay a tax for its purchase. Gandhi and his followers walked about 240 miles of the seacoast, collecting seawater in pools and letting the water evaporate to get salt. They also protested at British salt plants, but these protests ended in violence when the British attacked the peaceful crowd with steel-tipped weapons. An American journalist at this protest wrote about the event. The article was published worldwide and brought almost universal support for Gandhi and the Indian independence movement. Hurting economically, just as Gandhi intended, the British Parliament passed the Government of India Act in 1935, which meant that India was moving towards full independence. Political change was also coming, again, to China, thanks to the instability of the Chinese Republican government during and after the Great War. In 1917, Beijing leaders, then led again by Sun Yat-sen, had declared war on Germany, hoping that the Allies would react by pushing German and other Central Power influences out of China, thus allowing the Chinese to govern themselves. However, the peace agreements at the end of the Great War created various spheres of influence around the world, and China was not itself an influence, but rather fell within Japan's sphere of influence. As you know, between the 1850s and 1900, Japan had transformed itself into a formidable industrial power, one that was seen as nearly equal to the Western powers, while China was just that country that had been forced to adopt an open-door policy with the West. Outraged by this outcome, Chinese students staged the May 4th movement, which was led by schoolteacher Mao Zedong, a communist seeking to reform the Chinese government. In 1920, he formed and became the leader of the Chinese Communist Party. Mao looked to Lenin and the newly formed Soviet Union for guidance and inspiration. Sun initially decided to ally his party, the Kuomintang, to the Communists for greater national strength, and he committed to reorganizing China along Bolshevik ideals, which, after all, didn't seem all that different from the three principles. However, Sun died in 1925, and his successor, Chiang Kai-shek, was not so keen on the alliance with the Communists. In the spring of 1927, the Kuomintang broke the coalition and massacred communists of Shanghai. A year later, Chiang Kai-shek became the president of a new Chinese state, the Nationalist Republic of China, a government which was recognized by Western powers but not by the Soviet Union. Mao had escaped the Shanghai massacre and started planning a revolution against this new government. This revolution led to the Chinese Civil War, beginning in 1930. Mao and the communists, known as the Red Army, engaged in guerrilla warfare in the countryside against the government's forces, but they were outgunned and outnumbered. In late 1933, a nationalist army of about 30,000 surrounded the main communist stronghold, prompting the Chinese communists to flee toward the mountains of northwest China in what became known as the Long March of 1934. It would take them over a year to reach their destination because they fought continuously with the nationalists during the 6,000-mile journey. Of the 100,000 communists who began the Long March, only about 20,000 made it to the caves of northwest China, where they settled and began reforming so as to challenge the nationalists at some point in the future. And yet, that challenge wasn't to be, at least not then. All of a sudden, in the late 1930s, China had another outside threat to worry about: Imperial Japan. Around the turn of the 20th century, Japan had begun expanding their empire to the Asian mainland. In the 1890s, China and Japan had fought the first Sino-Japanese War over influence in the Korean Peninsula. When Japan won that war, and China was forced to recognize Korean independence. Between 1904 and 1905, Japan defeated Russia in the Russo-Japanese War and won undisputed control over the Korean Peninsula. And then after the Great War, Japan had been recognized as a regional power and granted a sphere of influence in the Far East. Then, in 1931, Japan occupied Manchuria, the very territory that had prompted the Russo-Japanese War. From Manchuria, the Japanese began a slow but steady push toward the Chinese border. In 1937, the nationalists and the communists, distracted by their civil war, almost didn't notice that Japan was about to invade. But invade Japan did. That invasion marks the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War, and for many historians, this also marks the beginning of World War II in Asia. But that's a story for another day. In 1938, with Japan in control of a large part of northeastern China, Mao's Red Army and Chiang's Nationalist Army agreed to a truce and pledged to fight together against this new imperial threat. So, in this interwar period, we had veterans and civilians struggling to make sense of what was now known as the war to end all wars. We had political and military chaos in Mexico and Asia. We had amazing cultural changes, including new ideas in science and technology. And then the experience of economic uncertainty with the Great Depression. As you can see, the 1920s were truly an age of anxiety, an age that absolutely extended into the 1930s and beyond, as we'll explore next.